Saint Augustine, African Influence in Christianity, the Christian Church Fathers. Chapter 2. The death of the last and greatest of the indigenous African Christian Church Fathers, Saint Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, 354 to 430 CE, North Africa, was the major event in Christendom's history which started the decline of power and control by the indigenous Africans in the Christian Church, especially the North African Church, the Mother Church. St. Augustine was born at Tagaste, Numidia, North Africa, November 15th, 354 CE. At the time, Numidia was a province of the Roman Empire. Augustine's birth having occurred exactly 40 years after Emperor Constantine the Great became sole ruler of the Roman Empire of the West and adopted Christian symbols after having dropped his divine role. Constantine, as he was called, mounted the Roman throne in the year 312 CE, more than 100 years after the indigenous Africans of the Empire of Kush, East Africa, had already established Christianity as the official religion of their empire. St. Augustine's birth followed the martyrdom of one of the other two indigenous African church fathers, St. Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, 249 to 258 CE. Cyprian was the African martyr that hollered these famous last words, Deo gratis, thanks be to God, upon being told that there was an order stating, quote, it pleases that Thracius Cyprian, his full name, be beheaded with the sword. This order was issued by Roman authorities who were trying to stomp out Christianity during and before Cyprian fled into hiding underground to continue his teachings of the ancient versions of the gospel of Christ, not as it had been corrupted today. This was during the reign of Emperor Galerius, who later on issued an imperial edict granting tolerance to the Christian community. Mrs. Stuart Erskine, considered an authority on this phase of Christian church history, in her book, The Vanquished Cities of Northern Africa, page 80, with regards to martyrdom, wrote that St. Cyprian faced death in honor as, quote, he died magnificently, giving 25 pieces of gold to the executioner. The same type of praises could have been heaped upon other great Africans who made Christianity, although Europeanized, what it is today, such as Namphamo, the first of the Christian martyrs. In conjunction with her martyrdom, C.P. Groves, in his book, The Planting of Christianity in Africa, page 59, wrote, a certain Namphamo, claimed as the first martyr, also came from Numidia, the name in this case being Punic, as from this point the story of the church in Africa unfolds before us. We find a devotion under persecution not excelled elsewhere, and a fervent fidelity to the faith expressed in Puritan ideals that gave Montanism a second home in Africa. The names Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine add an imperishable luster to the history of the African church. Added with Namphamo were the second and third Christian martyrs, Perpetua and Felicita, both of whom are also indigenous Africans. At this point, it is necessary to introduce another of the indigenous Africans known as the three most important church fathers of Christendom, Tertullian. He was born in Carthage sometime during the year 155 CE. In his era, he was revered as, quote, one of the most outstanding scholars in rhetoric, Latin, and Greek. His mastery of these disciplines led him into becoming the head of a Montanist community in his own homeland's capital city of Carthage, and it was his depth in and love for Latin which caused him to make it the official language of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, an outgrowth of the North African Church, and Christendom in general. Although listed last, Tertullian, a contemporary of the most noted of the indigenous African emperors of the Roman Empire, Septimus Severus, 146 to 211 CE, must be mentioned in the order in which he chronologically arrived in the history of Christendom. Before dealing with the role of Tertullian in the makings of Christianity, it is necessary to project certain background material on how Christianity came to the Northwest from Northeast and East Africa as a power block during the height of Roman imperialism and colonialism throughout most of North Africa. In North Africa, just before the period of Christianity's legal entry into Rome, due to Constantine the Great's conversion in the 4th century CE, there were many Hebrew tribes that were of indigenous African origin. These African Jews, as all other Romanized Africans of this era, were sought in a rebellion in Cyrenaica, during 115 CE against Roman imperialism and colonialism. This rebellion also marked the beginning of a mass Jewish migration southward into Sudan, along the way of the city of Air, and into the countries of Fouta Djallon and Senegal, which lie below the parabolic curve of the Niger River's most northern reaches, where the city of Tumbut, or Timbuktu, Mali, presently stands. These Jews were divided into two main groups and took separate directions further southward into West and Central West Africa. One group joined the Fulanis of Fouta Djallon, from whom the present population of indigenous Africans of Borneo and Kamen in Nigeria inherited their Hebrew traditions. This indigenous African Jewish penetration from North Africa into the Sudan even reached the borders of Lake Chad in Central Africa. The indigenous tribes of the Hebrew faith of Cyrenaica had migrated there by way of Numidia before the defeat of General Hannibal Barca and the conquest of Carthage by Rome in 202 BCE. Carthage, about 1000 BCE, was re-established by Phoenician mariners who had left the city of Tyre, around today's Middle East, under the leadership of Princess Elisar, Dido of Phoenicia. The place these mariners, the vast majority of whom were male, first conquered and settled on North Africa's coastline is today called Tunisia, previously Kahart Hadas, or the New Town, by its original indigenous African population. These mariners, who later on amalgamated with the indigenous Africans of Kahart Hadas and other regions around, also defeated other indigenous Africans further west along the coast of North Africa and established the city of Lixus, where presently the Kingdom of Morocco now stands. In Europe, along the Iberian Peninsula, these African Asian peoples also established the city of Cadiz, which is today called southern Spain, formerly Iberia. It is said, however, that the Phoenicians had already passed through the Pillar of Hercules, today's Strait of Gibraltar, formerly called the Strait of Tariq, taken from Gibra Tariqa, about 1100 BCE, approximately 100 years before they settled with the Africans of Kahart Hadas. Most European and European American writers have conceded that even though the thrust of Jewish involvement was in Egypt more than 300 years before their alleged expulsion or Passover, about 1225 to 1232 BCE with Moses by Pharaoh Ramses II, thousands of them had already preceded the Phoenicians' migration of 1000 BCE into the northwest regions of North Africa. But these same writers have utterly neglected to state that the Hebrews amalgamated with the fellow Africans they met both in Egypt and points farther northwest, southwest, and east. Approximately 65 years after the Cyrenaica rebellion in 115 CE and sometime before July 160 CE, Christianity was introduced into northwest Africa. This date is approximately true because there was never any mention of Christians there before in any of the records of the Roman imperial government that colonized the area. The first mention of the Christians came about with the martyrdom of many of their members on July 17th, 100 CE. There is no record giving the exact number of the original group either, only of those tried and found guilty of, quote, committing Christian acts against the Roman state, etc., were all mentioned. These were 5 women and 7 men, 12 in all. Among these martyrs was their 22-year-old leader, the person responsible for the total action of the group. She was a married woman and the mother of 1 child. This woman, Perpetua, was also of indigenous African birth. It is to be noted, however, that at this period in history Tertullian also made his presence felt as spiritual leader of all of Christendom, also that Christendom was still centered in North Africa under indigenous African control. It must be remembered that the Christians of Carthage were indigenous Africans brought in from the neighboring state called Numidia as slaves for the Roman imperialists who were ruling Carthage and other parts of North Africa at the time. It is also to be noted that among these earliest of Christian slaves of every color were Perpetua's brother and the same Felicita mentioned before, of whom it was said, quote, her ordeal caused the premature birth of her only child a few hours previous to her death as a martyr for Jesus Christ, etc. And in her honor a chapel named Saint Perpetua was built. It still stands at what was the center of the ancient African city of Carthage, presently a part of Arab-controlled Republic of Tunisia. This chapel was constructed with stone pillars and other materials taken from ruined structures that once adorned the glorious city of Carthage during the days of General Hannibal Barca, the African who once ruled all of the Iberian Peninsula, parts of southern Gaul, or France, and all of northern Italy for more than 20 years, with more than 100,000 indigenous African troops. Strangely enough, the greatest of the indigenous Africans who became emperor of the Roman Empire was charged by many European and European American Christian church historians of being, quote, the emperor who ordered the persecution and execution of Perpetua and her followers. His name, Septimus Severus, 146 to 211 CE. But the truth is that Emperor Septimus Severus did not mount the throne of the Roman Empire until 193 CE. This he did subsequent to the murder of Emperor Marcus Aurelius's son, Marcus Aurelius Commodus Antonius, about March 17th, 177 to 180 CE. Septimus Severus, at the time of his elevation to the throne of the Empire of Rome, was Rome's greatest general and a former civil magistrate. It is to be further noted that color was never a condition to his ascendancy to the Roman throne, as only one Roman governor had failed to accept this indigenous African's rule of imperial Rome. The dissident was Alanus, governor of Brittany, England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland today. But Emperor Septimus Severus quickly did away with this problem as he defeated and killed Clodius in 197 CE during the Battle of Lyon, France. Septimus Severus's victory over Clodius placed an African in complete control of every nation along both sides of the Mediterranean Sea and every European nation along the Atlantic Ocean up to and including Angloland, or Brittany. It also placed this African in charge of the entire Roman Empire at the time when the Roman military was being corrupted due to the extensive employment of mercenaries. Monetary inflation, coupled with high prices and overburdening taxes on all classes of the Roman peoples, also created chaos in the empire. These conditions brought into being the widespread, uncontrollable money lending and the serious decline in taxes to the extent that the imperial exchequer found it extremely difficult to collect the necessary taxes for the imperial treasury. During all of this turmoil, the Roman state was being challenged by a quote unquote new religion, Christianity, which had crossed over from North Africa and was giving every indication of causing further disaffection from the already disrupted Roman army, as it was already causing full-scale conversions by too many of Rome's finest military officers, including her best generals. This new religious force, in direct and open conflict with the existing official religion of the state, had even begun to gnaw away at the already disorganized Roman body politic. The seeds of all this had in fact started during the reign of Augustus Caesar, 27 BCE to 14 CE. However, at which time a quote unquote new God was born amongst the Hebrews. His name, Jesus Christ. The conditions already outlined, along with many more, forced Emperor Septimus Severus, as Emperor of Imperial Rome, to issue an edict in 202 CE. In this edict, he forbade any new conversions to Judaism or Christianity, neither of which he intended to stop, but instead check. The edict had been purposely overstated for religious bigots and overzealous racist lunatics alike. Some even dared to charge that the emperor, Septimus Severus, and the other indigenous Africans involved with the control of the Roman hierarchy was in itself the cause of the decline of the Roman Empire. But to this racist contention, the quote unquote renowned authority in this area of North African and church history, Jane Soames, in her book, The Coast of the Barbary, pages 30 and 31, wrote, at the height of Roman power in North Africa, the population of Italy was actually declining, and there was never any vast number of Roman colonists in the racial sense of the word. The Romans knew nothing of these modern emotions which are to us so powerful and omnipresent that we can hardly imagine a civilization from which they should be absent. She had neither color prejudice nor religious intolerance in the days of the Republic. The Christian martyrs of the early church suffered because they were felt to be a menace to the state, propagating doctrines subversive to good order and discipline. They were regarded as the communists of their day. But highly cultivated Roman opinion considered all religions to be essentially the diverse sanctifications of the great one truth, and had no conception of that white heat of missionizing zeal which would put whole populations of unbelievers to the sword or send men to the scaffold and the fire for the sake of disputed theological definition. All that part of the makeup of men's minds came later, as did the acute sense of differentiation of race and consequent antagonism which may be summed up in the phrase, quote unquote, color bar. On the other hand, many of today's religious fanatics continue to charge Emperor Septimus Severus of ordering, quote, the martyrdom of Perpetua, Felicita, and the other Christians on July 17th, 180 CE, etc., and of course of, quote, the persecution of the Christian church. But his detractors to date have failed to account for the fact that Septimus Severus did not become emperor of Rome until 193 CE, 13 long years after the reported persecution and martyrdom of his fellow indigenous Africans of the quote-unquote new religion, Christianity. Some historians, not knowing that the alleged martyrs were themselves also indigenous Africans, like the emperor himself, even dared to charge him with, quote, murdering white Christians. In their attempt to introduce color prejudice and racism into the history of a people who knew not what the term or feelings were. Why did Emperor Septimus Severus issue the edict barring further Roman conversion to Judaism and Christianity? For the same reason any president, king, emperor, or dictator and other types of sovereign today suppress any religion which stands to disrupt the orderly functions of the established government. For the same reason that the Nation of Islam, nicknamed Black Muslims, headed by the Prophet Elijah Muhammad, is being dismissed by the rulers of the United States of America as, quote, not amounting to a religion in the strict sense of the word, etc., and that Muhammad, its spiritual leader, is a, quote, false prophet who is fooling the Negroes. Also for the same reason that Muhammad Ali, or Cassius Clay, is not considered a, quote, minister of religion by the federal courts of the United States of America, as they consider other boxers who are members of the European American style Christian clergy. Yet, former repentant murderers and thieves in other acceptable religions, Judaism and Christianity, are accepted as having been, quote, called by God to his ministry. The ministry in this case is mostly European American style Judeo Christianity. Even Muslims from Mecca are not recognized in this context. It was therefore incumbent upon Emperor Septimus Severus, as Emperor of Rome, to protect his empire. Yes, even to the point of committing executions. For is it not true that every nation up to this very period in man's history commit murder in the same fashion when they condemn a suspected or convicted traitor to death and carry out said edict, which is much more sophisticatedly called, quote, judgment by a jury of your peers? Many wits have compared the Christians within the Roman Empire at this period with the communists of the United States of America during the Senator Joseph McCarthy era, and to a great degree even today. It is also true that there were those who hated both Jews and Christians within the Roman Empire, and most certainly they wanted to destroy Judaism and Christianity. But one must also remember that thousands of Christians went out of their way to be martyred in order to, quote, win the blessings of Jesus Christ, whom they believed during that period was about to make his, quote, second coming. At least that was the prevailing claim by the leaders of the new religion. It was in this type of atmosphere that Emperor Septimus Severus began his rule. Because of it, he made the Praetorian Guard universal and stopped the practice of having only legionaries stationed in Italy to fill vacancies as they arose. In so doing, he also militarized every aspect of the empire's civil administration with retired generals, to whom he owed his ascendancy to the throne. It was under these conditions that Emperor Septimus Severus's contemporary, another of the African, quote, fathers of the church, Tertullian, assumed control of the Christian minds of North Africa, the North African church, and influence over all Christendom, especially within the Roman Empire, but excluding Egypt and Ethiopia. Tertullian inherited the history of a church which had its African beginning with John Mark, evangelist, who did his missionary work in Egypt, where he established many churches in the city of Alexandria. But it was really during the episcopate of Demetrius of Alexandria, 189 to 232 CE, that the North African Church got its real beginning as a fully recognized religious body. This, of course, does not mean that the beginning of Christianity in Africa started at this juncture. The reference to the Ethiopian convert in Acts chapter 8, 26 through 40 of the King James Version of the Christian Holy Bible proves the contrary. The North African Church had already established the world-renowned catechetical School of Alexandria under the leadership of an African named Pantaenus, its founder. It was at this center of Christendom and Christian scholarship that the world's famous and most distinguished scholars of their time, Origen and Clement, served as bishops along with Pantaenus. It was also from this center that another African of Egyptian birth left to found the world's first monastery of Hermetic living. He was called, quote, Anthony, the Hermit of the Sahara, because he withdrew to that area to meditate in a life of poverty after abandoning his wealth to the Egyptian state. Tertullian, born in Carthage about 155 CE, was to become important in Christendom, as was his contemporary, the Emperor of Rome, Septimus Severus, in government. But this was not to be in the piously spiritual philosophy of his religion. His was the socio-economic relationship of Christianity to man and its cultural involvement, and to civilization in general. In light of this involvement, Tertullian wrote in one of his most famous works, called De Anima, the following: Surely a glance at the wide world shows that it is daily being more cultivated and better peopled than before. All places are now accessible, well known, open to commerce. Delightful farms have now blotted out every trace of the dreadful wastes. Cultivated fields have overcome woods. Flocks and herds have driven out wild beasts. Sandy spots are sown. Rocks are planted. Bogs are drained. Large cities now occupy land hardly tenanted before by cottages. Islands are no longer dreaded. Houses, people, civil rule, civilization are everywhere. The man who wrote this had drawn the attention of Christians everywhere, from their citadels in Egypt and Numidia to his own surroundings in Carthage, and to his memory the honored English historian, Miss Stuart Erskine, wrote, The three great names that bring honor to the African church are Tertullian, the first of the church writers who made Latin the language of Christianity, Cyprian, bishop and martyr, and Augustine, one of the most famous of the fathers of the church. Before his death in 222 CE, Tertullian had the honor of seeing the North African church grow from 23 bishops in 200 CE to approximately 70 or 80. But to really appreciate this African's role in the Christian church, one has to refer to Professor C.P. Grove's remarks on page 70 of this book. Cyprian, like Tertullian, was born in Carthage of indigenous African parentage, who were of wealthy means, but Cyprian's exact date of birth is unknown. However, it is known that he was at least 46 years old when he had his, quote, heavenly birth, the phrase he used for explaining his decision to leave the world of a life of wealth for that of religion and poverty. Cyprian's, quote, heavenly birth proved no problem to him, as he had held a professorship in philosophy at the University of Carthage and excelled in rhetoric. This background led him to become Bishop of Carthage in very little time subsequent to his religious transformation. The ascension of Cyprian to a bishopric also led him to his, quote, earthly death, for it was during his reign as Bishop of Carthage that the persecution of the Christians of North Africa really got underway. It was equally true for all of Roman Europe. The words of Mrs. Stuart Erskine best summed up his ending when she wrote, quote, he died magnificently, giving 25 pieces of gold to the executioners, end quote. Cyprian was fully aware of the possibility that he would be martyred, as the new religion he had embraced became an irritant to the vast majority of the Africans of Carthage and their Roman overlords. He had already seen and heard Christians being thrown to the lions at the amphitheaters as the crowds clamored, "Washed and saved." This expression having been originated by the Christians of Egypt and Numidia before it was adopted by the Brethren of Carthage as a rallying cry. Yet it was in other parts of the Roman Empire before its use in Carthage. But, as he expected, their cries very soon thereafter changed to "the bishop to the lions." Like any other man, this bishop was not interested in his own suicide, as he carried his teachings underground, whence he continued to lead the outlawed Christian assembly for years following. Cyprian, in his characteristic style, which was exclusively his, explained his plight and temporary safety thusly, quote, "The white rose of the crown of labor might be as fair as the red rose of martyrdom." Cyprian was to cry out in a sense of relief from the agony of evading the law and never knowing just when his end would come at the hands of the Roman imperial executioner, or by the claws and jugular cutting teeth of the lions. Thus his Deo gratis, or thank God, in response to the command, quote, "It pleases that Thracius Cyprian be beheaded with the sword." End quote. It was now 222 CE, 11 years after the death of Emperor Septimus Severus and the elevation of his only son, Caracalla, on the throne of the Roman Empire. It was also near the height of Emperor Caracalla's 212 to 217 CE attempt to exterminate the Christians from the empire. This period marked an era of one of mankind's most brutal high points of genocide, where one group exterminated the other because of the need to protect an empire. It must be carefully stated the extermination of the Christians was not because of their adherence to the new religion, instead because of the teachings of the religion that affected, quote, "law and order as established by the imperial government of Rome." The Romans at this period would have exterminated any group, religious or secular, because of their being annoyed at a dying empire. Neither was it race, as some historians have tried so hard to insinuate, nor was it color, which was not a factor in the societies of the ancients. The persecution of the Christians and Jews, irrespective of race or color, had reached its zenith, and Emperor Caracalla had succumbed totally to the bestiality of his colleagues in the Roman Senate and the army, who benefited materially from the confiscation of the personal and real properties of their martyred victims. Emperor Caracalla himself, however, was also murdered by the same army officers on April 8th, 217 CE. 67 years had passed. Rome was now ruled by Emperors Maximianus and Diocletian, 284 to 305 CE, who followed Caracalla and 15 others to the Roman throne, Macrinus to Carus. Yet the persecutors had continued for 19 years after Diocletian's rise to power in the east, slowing down somewhat in 303 CE, just 2 short years before Emperors Maximianus's and Diocletian's abdication in 313 CE. The persecution of the Christians actually stopped in Rome following the Emperor Galerius's May 305 or May 311 imperial edict, which granted tolerance to what had become a Romanized Christian church. The same Emperor Galerius had tried to persuade Emperor Diocletian to declare a, quote, "general persecutions of the Christians" on February 23, 303 CE. This is added proof that the persecution and prosecution of the Jews and Christians were much more political than religious throughout the Roman Empire. This being true even during the greatest height of the persecutions under the Emperor Caracalla. 1 year after the abdication of former Emperor Diocletian, 284 to 305 CE, Emperor Constantine the Great, 306 to 337 CE, had become the uncontested ruler of the Roman Empire of the West. In 324 CE, he had also become Emperor of the East, at which time he actually adopted Christianity and dropped all of the pretenses of his divine rights, the religious custom of his forerunners. Constantine the Great followed his own conversion by converting his own army through force, making them carry standards of the Christian Church, the so-called New Religion. Within a very few years later, the New Religion, North African Christianity, now Romanized European Christianity, had become the official religion of the entire reunited East and West Roman Empire. This was the religious and political picture of the Roman Empire when the greatest of the indigenous Africans that became one of Christendom's, quote, fathers of the church, a man who was born in the city of Tagaste, Numidia, November 15th, 354 CE, his name, Augustine, later on called Saint Augustine, 354 to 430 CE. Note that the nation of Numidia occupied an area of the territories now forming the nations of Algeria and Libya, North Africa. In dealing with the state of the Roman Empire at the time, St. Augustine was old enough to become the bishop of Hippo Regius, to the point where he had written the most profound philosophies on Christianity to date. The noted historian Jane Soames wrote, "The empire, essentially a federation of municipalities, tried unavailingly to prevent a movement which weakened and depopulated the cities, and at the same time delivered over the populace more and more completely into the hands of the great landlord, whose wealth depended upon their labor. It was in such a world, torn by civil strife and threatened by barbarian invasion, under the splendid but fading shadow of Rome, that St. Augustine's genius flowered. The Church in Africa had produced great men before this day. The writings of Tertullian and St. Cyprian both testify to its keen intellectual vitality, but neither achieved his stature. The last and noblest product of Roman African civilization. We learn a great deal about that civilization from the Confessions, the product of a mentality strikingly sympathetic to the European mind, though bearing the imprint of its African origin. The underscored words are to emphasize the value of St. Augustine's African background in all of his works, including the Confessions. Jane Soames continues in the next paragraph. St. Augustine is far more comprehensible to a European audience today than are most contemporary North African authors, a fact which is in striking disproof of modern racial theories, for it is community of philosophy which makes for affinity far more than the accident of birth. Jane Soames could have hardly explained the question of racism surrounding St. Augustine's African origin, as she most adequately cited the major importance in Augustine's being. Quote, "For it is community of philosophy which makes for affinity far more than the accident of birth." With respect to the Confessions mentioned by Jane Soames, another historian, Mrs. Stuart Erskine, wrote the following. St. Augustine's Confessions are the most familiar and intimate documents, whether he is approaching God, to whom they were made, or man, for whose benefit they were written down. He conceals nothing and is extremely modern in his point of view. This African, as, quote, the greatest of the church fathers, was also one of the greatest thinkers and philosophers of all time. With reference to the greatness of St. Augustine, Professor George H. Sabine wrote the following. The most important Christian thinker of the age now under discussion was Ambrose's great convert and pupil, St. Augustine. His philosophy was only in a slight degree systematic, but his mind had encompassed almost all the learning of ancient times, and through him, to a very large extent, it was transmitted to the Middle Ages. His writings were a mine of ideas in which
Later writers, Catholic and Protestant, have dug. It is not necessary to repeat all the points upon which he was in substantial agreement with Christian thought in general and which have already been mentioned in this chapter. His most characteristic idea is the conception of a Christian commonwealth as the culmination of man's spiritual development. Through his authority, this conception became an irreplaceable part of Christian thought, extending not only through the Middle Ages but far down into modern times. Protestants, no less than Roman Catholic thinkers, were controlled by St. Augustine's ideas upon this subject. His great book, The City of God, was written to defend Christianity against the pagan charge that it was responsible for the decline of Roman power and particularly for having caused the sack of the city by King Alaric in 410 CE. Incidentally, however, he developed nearly all his philosophical ideas, including his theory of the significance and goal of human history, by which he sought to place the history of Rome in its proper perspective. This involved a reinstatement, from the Christian point of view, of the ancient idea that man is citizen of two cities, the city of his birth and the city of God. On the one side stands the earthly city, the society that is founded on the earthly impulses of human nature, and on the other hand, the city of God, the society that is founded in the hope of heavenly peace and spiritual salvation. The first is the kingdom of Satan, beginning its history from the disobedience of the angels and embodying itself especially in the pagan empires of Assyria and Rome. The other is the kingdom of Christ, which embodied itself first in the Hebrew nation and later in the church and the Christianized empire. History is the dramatic story of the struggle between these two societies and the ultimate mastery which must fall to the city of God. Only in the heavenly city is peace possible. Only the spiritual kingdom is permanent.